Good morning, everyone, and welcome to day 56 of our 100 days together. Thank you for being here. I just want to give us a little recap of what's going to happen next 2 weeks. So we're still in our month of thoughts and emotions and feelings. So this week we'll finish up with relationships. Next week we'll talk about last few ideas I have about the relationship we have with ourselves. And then in January, we get to move on to some health and wellness ideas. So that'll give us new thoughts and new ways to think about our self-discovery journey. Today, we're going to talk about 3 tools to a healthier relationship. But first, I want to give you a visual that I have known for quite a while, and I think hopefully it'll be as helpful to you as it is to me. It's this idea of glass versus rubber balls. And I'm going to read a commencement speech to you, a man by the name of Brian Dyson. He was at the time the CEO of Coca-Cola. And he talks about this idea of glass versus rubber balls as it applies to work-life balance. And when I first heard of this idea, it came to me framed as 2 different types of relationships, and I'll explain that piece to you, but I didn't want to not read his version of it because it may apply to you, this work-life balance idea. So it starts with, sorry guys, let me just grab a mute button here. So it starts by, his commencement speech is, imagine life as a game in which you are juggling 5 balls in the air. And you name them: work, family, health, friends, spirit. You will soon understand that work is a rubber ball. If you drop it, it will bounce back. But the other 4 balls, family, health, friends, and spirit, are made of glass. If you drop one of these balls, they will be scuffed, marked, nicked, damaged, or even shattered. They will never be the same. So think about it. A glass ball is not only more fragile than a rubber ball, it's also more valuable. Family, friends, health, and spirit are much more valuable than work. It's important to give them higher priority so they don't get damaged and or destroyed. No one goes to his grave wishing that he had worked more. Keep your priorities straight. Taking care of your family, your health, your relationships, and your spirit is not a selfish act. It is a sustaining one. So again, when I first heard of this, I thought of the idea that at certain times in our life, certain relationships are that glass ball. They need to be more protected. They're more precious. They're more fragile. They're more important. And then we have these other relationships that we can consider rubber balls. So we drop them, they bounce back, they have their own momentum. Maybe once in a while we have to pick it up and drop it again so that it continues to move without as much attention, that much attention that it's getting from us. And then we take this time to really nourish and protect the glass balls that happen to be showing up that way in our lives. And I can tell you, sometimes it's a decade. The way that it shows up to me is, a certain period of my life where work was very important, especially for my husband. And kids were very, very important. So those were the relationships that got nurtured the most. Maybe my primary relationship was a rubber ball at that time, and it just created its own momentum. We kind of expected that to happen at that time in our lives. But now things have shifted. This has become our glass ball. And so less attention paid on outside relationships, because this is what needs to be nurtured right now. So the glass ball versus the rubber ball. So I hope that that's a nice visual and a nice metaphor for you to keep in your mind in terms of your primary versus secondary relationships. And so now on to the 3 tools. I'll have to frame this a little bit before we get to the actual tools. This again comes from our friends Phil and Barry out of the book, The Tools. And they talk about 3 building blocks to raising healthy relationships. They do point out 2 notes before they get into their main ideas. And one is that this could apply to all relationships. It doesn't necessarily have to be your significant other or romantic relationship. So you can think about how this may play out again at work or with your friendship relationships. And then they also say, which I really love, is that relationships have very little to do with our level of education, how psychologically sophisticated we are, and whether or not we had great models as relationships, i.e. our parents. It's just human nature. It's inherent that we have the capability and capacity to have really amazing relationships. So they say that it has to do with three very basic things: the goals and what we're striving for in our relationships. Number one is creating an emotional environment where we both feel close to one another. Again, doesn't have to be your primary relationship, can be just friendships, the relationships you have with your coworkers. Number two is to create an emotional environment where we trust one another. These are the basic ideas here. And number three, they call this the key, is that we want one another to get the most out of life. So it's an all for one, one for all type of relationship. And what's important to think about when we're talking about this is that the more that we do the opposite, so the more we create distance versus feeling close to one another, the more we create, the more that less trust comes in versus trusting one another, and the more that we do not want what's best for one another, the more normal that becomes. So that becomes a way of life. We don't even recognize it anymore. It's our norm. So then they go into the three tools. So, I'll talk about it in terms of how the negativity comes into our relationships, and of course the solution, so that we're looking at this in a positive frame, especially as we end our conversation. So the first is, of course, and again, this is such, may come across as common sense, so that I hope that it's not, doesn't come across as assuming, but remember when we first started talking about this, these are reminders, not necessarily new information. Negative judgments about one another, that's number one. And they talk about how it doesn't matter what it is. It can be the simplest things, the way someone chews this person, how you see them from the back, the simplest judgments about one another are obvious. We are such intuitive creatures that we recognize when someone is judging or being critical of us. And the bigger problem with that is that these things are transmitted in our minds. We can feel it, we understand it, and then we naturally just behave in the same way. So it perpetuates itself. It becomes a cycle. They talk about the solution, of course, is to catch this negative thought. So spend as much time as often as you can catching this negative thought, changing it with a positive thought, so as quickly as you possibly can. And then the piece that I love most about this tool is that they talk about coming up with a memory. So a time when you were very fond of this person that you're judging or being critical of, and replacing that with the negative energy. So number one, again, was negative judgments. So that's one way that we kind of rotten our relationships, and something that we can be working on thinking about. Number two is the inability to recognize the basic human need of your partner or this relationship. And they are to be admired, the basic human need, to be admired, to be seen in a positive light, and to be validated. And another great tool that they give is this idea of feeding the dog. So it seems kind of like a bit of a crude example, but it's the thought that when an animal, maybe an angry dog or animal comes towards you, you can either run, flee, defend yourself, or you can feed the dog, give it a treat, and or talk nicely to it. And it just changes the situation right away. So remember that when we're thinking about the basic needs of your partner, it's just nice to come into a situation feeding this person or this animal. Animal is the example, but feeding this person. And that's to show them that you admire them, you see them in a positive light, and you're validating them. So the first two we talked about, number one is how you think in your relationship, that's judging another person. Number two is how we communicate. So we think of feeding the dog, we think of validating that person that is so near and dear to us. And number 3 has to do with how we behave outside of our relationship. So they talk about trying to avoid making the relationship into the solution to all of your problems. And this is just being dependent on someone else for the solution to all of our needs and issues in life that happen to all of us. This is just, again, common humanity. They talk about the solution being holding on to things that are personally meaningful to you. That can be as simple as creativity. Of course, work is one of them, a skill or a hobby, being of service, your spirituality, and then also maintaining relationships with your friends. And the reason I wanted to bring this up and just add on this last piece that we've talked about before is this idea of unilaterality. So we're thinking about this because I suspect that the first thing that we think about is, okay, well, that's really easy to say and do, but what if your partner's not, and or this other relationship isn't showing up in the same light, in the same vein? And so it's a difficult thing to do. But remember this idea of unilaterality. Remember the idea that we are here in 100 days of self-discovery, which means we're the ones, we're chosen. We're the ones that are stepping up and trying to do better and be exemplars in this realm or idea of ideas. So as hard as it is, what I'm asking and kind of our task is to be the person that practices these things. We're here for a reason. It's our turn in a sense. And I hope that comes across in a really positive light, because I mean it in that way, of course. Unilaterality, the definition is undertaken or done by or on behalf of one side. So we're thinking of us stepping up to the plate and really practicing these things, whether or not our partner and or significant other or relationship is playing along at that particular time. So our homework, number 1, we're going to catch ourselves in negative thoughts or judgments. More importantly, we're going to insert a positive thought when that happens. And remember that memory. I think it's just a really beautiful way to reframe things. We think of a memory of when we were really fond of that person or things were going well. Remembering that attitude is, 99% of the reframe comes in just our attitude and how we're thinking about these things. Number 2, before we say anything to our partner and or significant other, another relationship, think about feeding the dog. Just think about it in those simple terms. Like, what can I do to temper this situation before I even make a comment or ask for a favor or ask a question? And number 3 is do things that are satisfying and meaningful to you this week, especially, this crazy week. And make those things independent of your relationship. And then they gave a little, what I see as a little bit of a joke at the end. They said, number 1, this week as your homework, see whether or not this has helped your relationship at all. So let's create some awareness around this. And number 2, continue doing these 3 things for the rest of your life. I'll add number 4, and that is to be really aware of these glass balls versus rubber balls, if that resonates with you. Taking very good care of the relationships that are glass balls in your life right now, allowing and trusting that those other relationships that are rubber balls will bounce and create their own momentum. They'll be there for you when you need them. And last but not least, tomorrow we're going to talk about a word, entropy, and how that relates to our relationship. So hopefully that'll be really interesting. Until then, happy Monday, last Monday before Christmas. I hope it kicks off to a wonderful week. I certainly love and adore all of you. And thanks for being here. Take care, everybody.